In 1966, I was walking down the street in Mashhad. It's located here in northeastern Iran. It's the major metropolis of northeastern Iran. And a young man caught up with me who wanted to practice his English, and I didn't particularly want to practice with him, but we conversed anyway, and after a while he ascertained that I was an American graduate student, and I ascertained that he was the son of the governor. And then he asked me a difficult question. He said, "What do you really think of Iranians?" And he really pressed me on this. Really, what do you really think of Iranians? And I almost told him. In fact, I found the rigid class divisions of pre-revolutionary Iran so abhorrent that I was not particularly warm toward Iranian society. In fact, I much preferred Afghan society, almost from the very moment of crossing the border from Iran to Afghanistan, some weeks later. But I did not answer the question, and then he volunteered the answer. And he said, "Mahmoun Doust," which means the friend of the guest. I said, yes, that's the very word I was about to come up with, Mahmoun Doust. Iranians are the friend of the guest. And he was very serious. And it is, in fact, a very serious aspect of the culture. And insofar as Iran is a culture that we can trace back, or has a culture that we can trace back in one form or another to somewhere around 2000 BC, one of the things that we find is that when you get back to the roots of Iranian culture, and indeed the roots of the related cultures of other Indo-European language groups, the word host and the word guest are the same. Host and guest come from the same root, because the key thing about a host and a guest is that it's a relationship. It isn't that one owes something to another, owes hospitality, or the other owes something to the first. It's that is a fundamental relationship. And it's a relationship that is so important that you find it spelled out in some detail in the Iliad, in the conversation between Diomedes, the son of Tydeus, and Glaucus, where they're about to kill each other in battle. And then, but first, of course, they introduce their families, saying, "I am the son of so-and-so," and then one of them says, "Oh, but your father and my father had a host-guest relationship, and therefore we can't kill each other, even though we're on opposite sides, because that bond, that common feeling between the host and the guest is too important to give way to the current political difficulty." If President Bollinger had taken this course prior to introducing President Ahmadinejad a year ago, history would have been different. Having no clue that being rude to a guest was about as wrong a thing as you can do in Iranian cultural terms, and not being willing to let anyone vet his speech beforehand, President Bollinger chose to insult his guest, although he would say the invitation was actually issued by the acting dean of the School of International Public Affairs, therefore it wasn't his guest, but everyone thought he was his guest. And the result was a public relations bonanza in which both sides concluded that they won. President Bollinger, I think, was proud of the fact that from his point of view, as a legal mind specializing in issues of freedom of speech, he had affirmed the freedom of speech for someone whose views he found abhorrent, and B, he had then spoken truth to power, and he had had the courage to confront the president of Iran on a variety of issues that were of concern to him and whoever it was who enjoyed the speech. From the Iranian point of view, President Bollinger represented the ultimate in American arrogance. You know, it's one thing to invade someone's country, overthrow their government, and say that you want to install democracy, which we haven't done in Iran. You know, we have weeks to go before this occurs. But it's one thing to do that, but to insult a guest is far worse. So when President Ahmadinejad returned to Iran, I knew from talking to the Iranian ambassador that they had seen the confrontation between him and President Bollinger as a great event from Iranian point of view. When he got back to Iran, someone in the office of the president, no author was named, wrote a book, about 120 pages in Persian, about the visit to New York by President Ahmadinejad. And in the book, the Iranian president's 2 hours at Columbia were portrayed as a victory of greater proportion than the Iranian army's victory over Iraq in the Foul Peninsula campaign during the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq war. There were people in Iran, particularly wounded veterans and veteran families, who felt that 2 hours on a stage in an American university were not the same as losing life and limb in battle against the Iraqis. And they protested this book so strongly that the book was withdrawn from sale and disappeared, except in the PDF file I happen to have. But it's representative of how profoundly differently an event can look from different perspectives, and of how a lack of cultural sensitivity on one side or another, or too often on both sides, can lead to a debacle. A year ago, when we were arranging the talk for President Ahmadinejad, the concern was that we were about to go to war with Iran. At least that was my concern. That was why I pushed to have that invitation issued. I felt that a war with Iran would be a tragedy for both sides. A year from now, we're going to do this again, in some likelihood. That is to say, if President Ahmadinejad is reelected next August when he stands, when the Iranians have the presidential election, if he is reelected, then everything that is associated with his name and reputation will be back on the table as an international problem. You know, will it be necessary in the eyes of American policymakers to go to war with Iran? And surely hope Sarah Palin makes the right choice, because I wouldn't want lack of knowledge or cultural insensitivity to distort things. But right now, we're in the eye of the hurricane, to coin a metaphor, because it's too late to attack Iran before the end of the Bush administration. And no one's going to attack Iran at the beginning of the next administration because they don't want to get Ahmadinejad reelected. So we have about 10 months of the likelihood of comparative lack of saber rattling. And this makes us a good time to study the history of Iran. We're not quite being overshadowed by an imminent war, and yet Iran is of great enough concern to be important, I think, to every American. This course deals with pre-modern Iran, as I said, and indeed will go back to very early history. But as in the case of any course in history, what you do in the course is conditioned by the world in which you are currently living. Iran and India share, by the standard academic interpretation, important common features. By that I mean that the earliest language we know, that is an Iranian language, the language of the sacred book of the Zoroastrians, known as the Avesta, and in fact the language of a portion of that book known as the Gathas. These present themselves in the Avesta as being hymns written by Zarathustra. Zarathustra, whom the Greeks knew as Zoroaster, the religion that evolves from the teachings of Zarathustra is called Zoroastrianism. It survives today primarily in India, in the community known as the Parsis. The word Parsi reflecting the Persia that they migrated to India from after the Arab conquests in the 7th century AD. But the language of the Avesta is so close to the earliest known language of India. By known, I mean one for which we have a written version. And that is the language of a large collection of hymns. There are 10 books of these, known as the Rig Veda. And the language is often referred to as Vedic because it is the language of the Rig Veda and of several other collections of works that are subsequent to the Rig Veda. And it is the language from which Sanskrit evolves, but it is substantially different from Sanskrit. That is to say, if you read Sanskrit, you cannot read the Rig Veda. And for Hindu priests who study the Rig Veda, who memorize the Rig Veda, their understanding of the meaning of the Rig Veda usually comes from their reading of a Sanskrit commentary on the text, rather than from understanding the words of the text itself, because there is a substantial evolution between the language of the Rig Veda and the classical Sanskrit language, and then another substantial evolution between the classical Sanskrit language and the languages of modern India that derive from it, such as Bengali or Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Gujarati, etc., languages of northern India. there is a parallel, profound evolution between the language of the Avesta and the Persian that we have of today. And yet they clearly come from, the language of today clearly comes from that original language. Well, the striking thing, of course, is that Avestan and Vedic are almost identical. If you can read Vedic, you can wing it with Avestan. It's harder to do it the other way around because the quantity of text available in Avestan is much smaller than the quantity available in Vedic. But with simply a few minor sound changes, it's the same language. A major sound change is that an H in Vedic becomes an S in Avestan and vice versa. But once you've switched your S's and your H's, then you're sort of on interchangeable grounds. There's a reason we have a word like Hind, that means India, and a word like Sindh, that refers to the southern province of Pakistan, which happens to encompass the valley of the Indus River and is, in fact, Hind. Sindh, Hind, S-H. It's the same place. But sometimes S's get preserved, sometimes H's get preserved. So we know that there's a common heritage there that has strong heritage, a strong effect down to the present day. In India, this is a political football. What I mean by that is that the people who discovered, the scholars who discovered the relationships between not just Vedic and Avestan, but among all the Indo-European languages from Ireland to Bangladesh, and re-understood the language history as this ramified tree of language groups that come from some somewhat mysterious homeland somewhere north of both Iran and India. In certain political circles in India, this is regarded as a lie. It is not a benign lie. It is a lie that is representative of the desire and the intent of Western imperialists to portray India as a victim and a willing victim, a squishy, soft, cowardly victim of foreign cultural invasion. The story goes that if you believe this Western fantasy that people came into India from the north and brought with them a language, and brought with them a religion, brought with them a culture that then transformed India, and from which Hinduism ultimately derives, and indeed Buddhism, Jainism, and so forth. If you believe that fantasy of an invasion, then you're more willing to accept the idea that when the Muslims invade after the year 1000 AD and they come into India, then India again becomes the cowardly victim of invasion. And then when the British come a few hundred years later, then India again falls on its back and gives up, because India is simply a wimpish country, can't stand up for itself. But from this point of view, this is entirely a fantasy. The philologists, the historians, the archaeologists who invented the story of invasion were simply working for the CIA or its notional predecessors in earlier centuries. They were tools of the imposition of Western imperialism cultural imperialism, religious imperialism, economic imperialism, political imperialism upon India, and they invented a myth that said that India doesn't know how to resist. So the modern Indian Hindu nationalist movement, represented by the BJP party in India, a very powerful political party, boldly says this story of invaders from the north is a fantasy invented by people who want to subordinate India. And of course, they will cite my esteemed colleague Edward Said as the theoretician who explains how this sort of thing can happen. And some of them will go farther and say that the Indo-European language family, if all of these languages from Bengal to Ireland are in fact related, that the reason they're related is that they all come from India. That far from being the victim of imperialism, India is the source of civilization for the entire world. That India had the first civilization, that Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, Europe, everyone took the gifts of civilization from India, and India is the original fount of all civilization. Now that's a political position. It's a political position that has a very, very striking appeal in some segments of Indian society, such that the BJP, aided by this sort of ideology, was able to become the governing party for a period of time and remains a very powerful force. Now, ironically, or not ironically, let's say paradoxically, no one in Iran has ever complained about being invaded from the north by the original Indians and Iranians who are thought to have carried out this invasion. So two countries, both of them victims of invasion. One of them says it never happened. We must defend our identity, our integrity against this myth. The other one says, what a cool myth. We must be great conquerors. We're the Iranians. And in fact, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any Iranian who's ever even heard of the questions that the Indians are raising about their common history, because the Iranians accept without exception that they are the descendants of triumphal invaders from the north. Now, how can you get two countries, and indeed the Iranians would not be very happy with the idea that their civilization came from India. You're getting debates over what does come from India. There's a question of which country invented chess and which one invented backgammon or parcheesi. But aside from that, the Iranians rarely think that they took anything from India. So why does this happen? Why do you get completely different reactions to an academic theory in essentially neighboring countries? They're not quite neighboring, because Pakistan is in between, and Pakistan doesn't have an opinion on this, or very much else, because they can't agree on anything. But now the reason it happens is because India became part of the British Empire, and Iran did not. Iran became subordinated to the imperialist designs and influences of Russia under the Tsars and of Great Britain, but it never lost its independence. It was one of very few countries in the world in the early 20th century that retained independence. Ethiopia, Siam, Turkey. There weren't many that maintained their independence in the heyday of imperialism, but Iran was one. So even though resistance to imperialism, whether it's Russian or British or American, is a very powerful theme in in teaching modern Iranian history. Indeed, for some people, the dominant theme. It is rarely construed as a part of a model that goes back to ancient times in the way that it is in India. So in this way, how you read the history now and how you talk about it depends a lot upon what your fairly recent political history has been. Now in Iran, the recent political history obviously has been the revolution and the rise of the Islamic Republic. But the flip side of that is the end of the rule of the Iranian kings. In 1971, Iran celebrated the 2,500th anniversary of continuous Iranian imperial greatness. This was a fantasy. You did not have 2,500 continuous years of Iranian imperial greatness. You had Iranian dynasties from time to time. But it was a fantasy that was part of a ruling strategy put about by the then ruling monarch of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, himself of peasant origin, or his father was. But the last name that his father adopted Pahlavi, a name that was uniquely held by that family, because the one other family that had the name was paid off to switch to a different name, because the Pahlavi family wanted to be unique. But the word Pahlavi is the word that is used for the dominant written language of Iran in the period before the Arabs conquered. In other words, this is a word resurrected by scholars to symbolize the independence of Iranian culture from the Islamic culture that came in and superseded the last ruling Sassanid Persian dynasty, that of the Sassanids. So there was a very conscious desire to pump up the myth of Iranian imperial greatness. You deliberately take a name that goes back to the period before the Arabs came, and you link that name to the current ruling dynasty, that of the Pahlavi family, and you then promote the idea that kings are wonderful. One reason it was awkward to visit Iran in those days was that being in an absolute monarchy as an American didn't feel right. Nevertheless, you can still go to Abu Dhabi or places like that and get the genuine feel of royal autocracy if you wish. It's something you enjoy. But the fact of the matter is that the story of Iranian kingship was a myth. Prior to the assumption of power by the father of Mohammad Reza Shah himself, the country had been ruled for a century and a half, slightly less, by a dynasty of kings known as the Qajars. Before the Qajars, there were the Safavids. Now, what is striking about the Qajars, as the last long-ruling dynasty of Iranian Shahs, is that they were Turks. We know the origin of the Qajar tribe. It doesn't come from Iran. It comes from central Turkey. and it was one of a group of tribes collectively known as the Kızılbaş, meaning the redheads because of the turbans they wore. It's one of a group of tribes that existed in the 1400s in northern Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and central Turkey, who banded together to follow a religious guru who was descended from a saint named Safiuddin. And they became, the descendants became the ruling dynasty of the Safavids, but the power that put them in place was 100% Turkish. They themselves were probably Kurds, but that's debated. They certainly have some Kurdish background. Prior to that, Iran had been ruled by Turks for pretty much the entire time from 1036 down to the rise of the Safavids in 1500. So you already have almost 500 years of the rule of Turks in Iran. And then you have two dynasties, the Safavids followed by the Qajars, and they're all Turks. But these are the Iranian Shahs, holding up the great historic banner of Iranian kingship. Why in the world does a country that's ruled by Turks take so much pride in being an Iranian country? Now that they use Persian as their language, well, for that matter, the Turks ruling in Turkey used Persian, as did the Muslims ruling in India. Persia had become the standard administrative language from Calcutta to Istanbul. So the fact the government used Persian is less important than it seems. When you read histories of the Turks, let's say if you go back to the probably greatest living Turkish historian, Halil İnalcık. Halil Bey's still alive, isn't he? I think so. When he writes a standard book on the history of the Ottoman Turks, he makes a very strong linkage between the history of royal rule of the Persians and the dynasty established in Turkey after 1300 by the Ottoman Turks. And he says that what you have there is a concept of royalty, a circle of justice, in which the king is the ultimate dispenser of justice. The army is the instrument by which justice is made real for the population. And the population pays taxes to support the king and the army because that is the way they achieve the justice. The king and the army themselves, particularly the army, don't pay taxes. And in this circle of justice, you have a rebirth of an ancient Iranian notion of kingship. What Professor İnalcık does not talk about is Islam, as if somehow the 400, 500 years that had elapsed from the end of the last Persian dynasty down to the beginning of this Ottoman period, actually more like 600 years, 700 years, as if that hadn't counted. Well, this is partly because in the modern Turkish Republic that comes into being after World War II, you don't talk about Islam as a historical force. It's a secular republic founded by and dedicated to the principles of a phenomenally secular individual, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And religion was, it wasn't banned, but it was understood by the government to be a negative force that should live in people's hearts, but should not be on the street. So talking about the influence of Islam was more or less forbidden in Turkey, certainly by distinguished professors. So there you had a reason to link Turkish sultans with Ottoman shahs and skip the Islam part. In Iran, you had a desire to link the Pahlavi family with the pre-Islamic dynasty of the Sassanid shahs and skip the Islam part. Everywhere, there seem to be political reasons to skip the Islam part. In India, the Islam part was to be looked upon as another of these fantasies of invasion that somehow you could afford to ignore. Obviously, the Iranian Revolution and everything that has occurred since then has taught one lesson, if no other, and that is you can't skip the Islam part. However, a generation and more of historians dealing with Iran were schooled to think of Iran as a land of kings. There were books written on this theme, and I've cited 3 of them here. These are the 3 most recent, by Michael Axworthy, Gene Garthwaite, and Elton Daniel. I regret to say I think all 3 books are quite mediocre, but they will tell you the stories of the Iranian kings. And if you're into the stories of kings, by all means read one. Read all 3, or read none, because the Iranian kings are gone. This doesn't mean that kingship has no importance. But it does mean that we lost, between Turkey and Iran in particular, we lost 2 or 3 generations of scholarship that could have been profoundly different if you had not had the particular political formations in the Turkish Republic or in the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran that put strong pressures on historians to bend the historical record in one direction or in another direction. There are pressures today to bend the historical record in one direction or another direction. All you have to do is tune into websites that compare President Ahmadinejad to Adolf Hitler, and you'll find a certain pressure to bend the story of Iran in a particular direction. But I don't want to do that in this course, to bend it in a particular direction other than my direction. I'm not a neutral party here. I have the first college paper I ever did research on was in the summer after I graduated from high school in 1958, and it dealt with Iran. And I have been paying attention to Iran for the last 50 years. I've been to Iran numerous times. I have met more important Iranian politicians by far than I have met American politicians. And I probably am more comfortable with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Comfortable with rather than supportive of, than any other professor in the country. And I might as well say that up front. If that hadn't been the case, I wouldn't have been approached last year to be the intermediary to set up the speech by President Ahmadinejad at Columbia. But that being said, I have no desire to favor the Islamic Republic of Iran, but I do have a very strong desire to bring Islam back into the story. Iran today is not a country full of devout people. Even before the Iranian Revolution, there were Shiites in India who were very outspoken in saying the Iranians do not know how to love Hussein or to love Ali. That if you're going to be Shia, you have to be an Indian Pakistani. I remember publishing in the Journal for Iranian Studies an article by a scholar of mixed Indian and Iranian family background called Growing Up Shia in India. And he gave many details about this, and particularly on and on about how his mother would say, your father was a Persian. He did not know how to love Ali. So Iran is not now and has not ever been a land of fanatics. If you were to go to Iran now and party down with your age mates in Tehran, there is nothing that you could find at a youthful party in Williamsburg that you couldn't find in Tehran. There is no drug that you could not find. There is no music you could not listen to. There is no manifestation of modern youth culture that you can't find in Tehran. You just can't take it outdoors. So we're not dealing here with this stereotype of a uniformly fanatic and deeply religious country. I'll be arguing later on that Iran has become increasingly secular ever since the revolution, and I'll give my reasons for arguing that. However, the opposite contention, that religion is irrelevant to Iran, to the current Islamic Republic, and to the entire shape of Iranian society, I think that is equally mistaken. Islam is not irrelevant either to the current articulations of Iranian society or to the structures upon which that society is built, whether they are economic structures or educational structures or religious structures. Islam is extremely important to Iran, and it is uniquely important to Iran insofar as Iran is the only independent Shiite country in the world. Therefore, it is a country where, once Shiism became the official touchstone of the government, the role of Shiite Muslim institutions became far more pronounced than you would find in other Shiite populations, such as Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Pakistan, where the degree of hegemony exercised by Shiism is much less. So Islam is important in many ways, and I'm going to talk extensively about this. If you read any of these three books, you'll find they skip pretty much the early Islamic period. They don't find anything to say because there aren't any shahs. If there aren't any shahs, where is Iran? And this is one of the things that makes these books inadequate. Let me go back to this question of invaders from the north. As I said, the linguists in the 19th century created this notion of a family of related languages. That language family, which is called Indo-European, is identified because of the vocabulary and grammatical similarities among this huge set of languages, including virtually every language of India, most of the languages of every language of Europe, most of the languages of northern India, and in between the languages of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Iran. At one time, this family was much more extensive. In other words, these are all speakers of Iranian languages in here. And originally, it went up much farther and all the way over to the frontiers of China. We know of speakers of Indo-Iranian languages that were not actually in the main part of China. They did not get down into the North China Plain, but they lived in Gansu, which is sort of corridor to the northwest that links China with Inner Asia. And they were all over in Xinjiang, which is the area today where you have Turkish independence movements by the Uyghur Turks, and the Iranians are all gone. So that these people once spread far to the east and then they retracted. At one time, they were the dominant people here. They were superseded by the Turks. In other words, this is a flexible geography. But the question that has arisen, two questions have arisen, is first, where did these people come from? And second, why did they spread so widely, and how did they spread so widely? There is a new book on this subject by David Anthony called Language, the Horse, and the Wheel. That is probably the best synthesis that anyone has come up with. What he maintains, here's the Black Sea, the northern border of Turkey. Here's the northern edge of the Black Sea, and up above there, in an area about like that, what's called the Pontic Steppe, or the Black Sea steppelands, Pontic Plain. That is where, he argues, the Indo-European homeland was located. This is a homeland where a hypothetical language known as Proto-Indo-European was presumably spoken. Proto-Indo-European, usually abbreviated as PIE, has been reconstructed. We have no text at all existing in PIE. It's been reconstructed by trying to back engineer the language changes from all over the language family. And this, for example, is how it's determined that in PIE, guest and host are the same. Is that you work back to the original form. In working back to the original form, even though it is hypothetical, you reach certain cultural conclusions. For example, if you find that every Indo-European language, let's say, has a word for big fish, and it's the same word, then they must have all come from a place where they had fishing. Well, that's not very specific. Now, at one time, people thought it was specific because the word was lox. And people said, oh, they all had salmon. And if they all had salmon, they must have had sour cream and probably bagels. And therefore, we have to go to Poland. But then people realized further that lox didn't necessarily mean salmon. Or other words did not, that they could have a more complex meaning. Yeah.
Isn't there something about the word wheel that was actually
yes.
Came up simultaneously before it was after?
The word wheel shows up in all the Indo-European languages, as does the word axle, as does the word yoke, or what links two animals to pull a vehicle, as does the word thill. If anyone happens to know what a thill is. Trying to remember what a thill is. Thill is the technical term for the pole that sticks out in the front of a cart and you hook the yoke to. The axle links the wheels. The thill goes out. It's usually referred to as a cart pole or something like that, or a chariot pole. But thill, etymologically, is the one that shows up in all these languages. And so there's and they all have the same word for horse, or a related word for horse. So there was a conclusion made that prior to these to this Proto-Indo-European breaking up, there must have been horses and vehicles in the homeland. And then that gives you an archaeological target. You can say, where do you have horses? And where did you have wheels? And then you'll find out it's a little better than looking for lox and bagels. And you think, well, does that pin it down very much? But there were no horses in Iran in prehistoric times. There were no horses up here in Central Asia. They had equids. You gotta be very tricky when you're dealing with your horse anatomy. The equid that you had in Iran was known as the onager or the hemione. Hemione is from hemi, meaning half, and Greek onos, meaning the Greek word for donkey, and so this is technically a half-ass. Iran is the homeland of the half-asses. Explains a lot of their politics. So onager and hemione, there's also something sometimes talked about as a hemippus, meaning a half horse. But in any case, from here down to here, the Sahara Desert, North Sudan, this is the land of the donkey people, or the land of various types of donkeys. All of the domestic donkeys of today come from down here. They're the domestic form of the Nubian wild ass from the Sudan that originally was how do I turn the damn thing on? The onagers were in Syria and Iran and Arabia and stretch up through here. But they're different from horses. They have longer ears. They have a stiffer and more upright mane. And they don't have a nice tail. They have sort of a crummy tail. So when you look for images of horses, you look for a mane that is leaning over, and you're looking for a full tail and short ears. Once you get down south of the Sudan, then you get into the land of the zebras. There are 4 species of zebras, and they're equids. And they can be distinguished by different patterns of stripes. So we have 4 species of zebras. Then north of them we have half a dozen species of donkeys or onagers. Once you get out here in Central Asia, going over toward Mongolia, there are 2 different types of asses. And then once you get up to the grasslands, up here, the area is teeming with horses. That's where the horses are. By teeming with horses, what I mean is that early archaeological finds in that area will frequently show 70-80% of all the animal bones are horse bones, because people lived by eating horses. This is where the horse hunters lived. And you had a culture devoted to hunting and killing horses.
The Cherkess culture?
The Cherkess? One of many. Okay, when did horses become domestic? Because if you're talking about horses in conjunction with wheeled vehicles, then you're talking about domestic horses. The Iranians, when they came down from the north, had vehicles, chariots, drawn by horses. So now you're getting into an area where you can start to put a time limit on things. The arguments over horse domestication are complicated, and I don't particularly want to go into them. They're also they're complicated both by the material evidence, which these days focuses upon wear on the teeth caused by a bit, and they're complicated because of theories of what happens when a segment of a wild population of any species becomes genetically tame and you have a domestic species. The dating of horses being under control is probably more reliable than the idea of when horses become domestic. What I mean by that is that in a wild animal population, if it is a population of animals that are subject to a substantial amount of predation by wild animals, lions, wolves, whatever, in the wild state, the animals that are able to run the fastest or fight the hardest, and the ones that are the most wary, are the ones that survive to give birth to the next generation. What this means is that at the time of sexual maturity, for most mammals, you have a huge increase in testosterone and in adrenaline production. So that the males, at least, but all the adult animals to some degree, have a greatly increased fight or flight reaction. Those that run the fastest and fight the hardest survive, and those that pause to smell the flowers or get another bite of grass, they're eaten, and they don't contribute to the gene pool for the next generation. So what you have is a steady and generation on generation repeated tendency for the animals with the highest fight or flight reactions, the highest adrenaline output, to survive to produce the next generation if you have a great deal of predation in an area. If you put animals under fixed control, you put them in corrals or in stalls or in laboratory cages, if you control them, those animals with very high fight or flight reactions become very, very upset because you're triggering this adrenaline response every time you shut them in or poke them with a stick or pull them with a rope, whatever you're trying to do. The most excitable animals, when you take an animal, a population under control, the most excitable animals do not reproduce at all. They're too upset to have sex. Humans, being perhaps the first domestic species, have kind of lost that sense of being too geared up to have sex, because usually, you're really excited, but sex is sex. And why would one pass that up? But the animals with the lowest fight or flight reaction are the ones that contribute to the next generation in domestic populations. The result is, and it's been measured in experimental results in 20th century experiments with foxes and otters and rats and other smaller animals where you get a series of generations. The net result is that over a period of generations, something like 20 generations, the natural adrenaline output of animals that were whose ancestors were originally captured in the wild, the natural adrenaline output may fall by 75%. And now you have a group of animals that are genetically tame. That is to say, they pass on calmness and controllability to their offspring genetically. In with really, really strong cases of this. For example, in the captive gray experiment done with gray rats, in the first generation, 80% of the rats did not reproduce at all. And all of those that did have offspring failed to take care of the offspring. So the offspring had to be fostered onto lab rats that were already tame in order for anybody to survive. And then you go down 20 generations and the rats are perfectly docile. Same thing with foxes. You start out with almost no foxes reproduce. You go down 20 generations and you have foxes that purr and rub up against your leg and lick you, and they want to sit in your lap and anything to get you to feed them. And they reach adulthood and they continue to do the same thing, because adulthood ceases to be this huge hormonal period of change. One of the characteristics of domestic species, whether you're talking about pigs or dogs or any number of other species, is a retention into adulthood of juvenile characteristics, because many of the hormonal changes associated with sexual maturity fail to take place. Now with horses, I teach a course in history of domestic animals, and so I'm afraid, go on almost endlessly on this subject. But with horses, we have a real question. How much predation did the horses of Inner Asia, the horses of the Eurasian grasslands, how much predation did they experience? The land between, let's say here, the end of the Black Sea and the Danubian plain, from here across to about here, the western border of Mongolia, is grass. The word we use when it's in Eurasia is the steppe, or steppe, good German word. In the United States is what we call prairie. If you've ever visited long grass prairie in the Middle West, now it's kind of a vogue out in Iowa and Minnesota to recreate prairie. And you can get, you buy your seeds and you pull out the weeds, and you know, after a certain number of years, you reproduce the prairie that existed there at one time. And long grass prairie has grass that's, 5 feet long, and endless grass. And that is what Inner Asia was like. Huge grasslands punctuated by a series of rivers that most of which flowed from north to south along here, whole series along the northern coast of the Black Sea, and the Volga and the Ural River flow into the northern part of the Caspian Sea. Once you get out here, these rivers go into deserts. They don't make it to the grasslands. But you have other rivers over here that flow northward into the Arctic Ocean, the Ob, the Yenisei, and others. This is land that you cannot farm, or at least you could not farm in antiquity. The reason you can't farm it is twofold. First, you can't farm it because it doesn't have enough rainfall. In a good year, it has enough rainfall, but it doesn't consistently have enough rainfall for farming. Look at the history of Nikita Khrushchev's Virgin Lands project in Kazakhstan, and you see the vagaries of climate affecting an effort to turn Kazakhstan into an agricultural, grain-bearing area. The other reason you can't farm it is because of the grass. If you, in, let's say, 1900, if you were in central Illinois and you wanted to plow up virgin prairie, you took what was called a breaking plow, which meant a plow with a share about that deep, and you hooked up 8 oxen to it, 4 teams of oxen, and you broke through the roots of the grass. But the roots are so deep and so tangled that unless you have a really heavy-duty plow, you can't plow that land. So where you had farming was in the river valleys. Not extensively, but rather narrowly within river valleys where seasonal flooding and so forth would keep the grass from growing, and you could have some bottomland that you could plant. But what it meant was that in this area where the ancestors of the Iranians began to form, up in here, this is not the this is not a farming land. Most of the people who learned how to herd horses, right down to, say, 2000 BC. Let's say between 4000 BC and 2000 BC, we have the development of horse culture in this steppe land. And none of the archaeological complexes that have been found dating to that period show extensive evidence of any farming. This doesn't mean that they didn't consume grain, because there were wild grains that show up that never become domestic. Amaranthus and goosefoot, if you happen to be looking for some wild grain. I don't know what amaranthus or goosefoot look like, but zoology rather than botany is my field. So they did eat grain, but they didn't farm. So this is not an offshoot of the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent. This is where grain farming develops. This is the Fertile Crescent here. It's defined hydrographically as being the line of 8-inch annual rainfall. In other words, as you get 8 inches to the west of this line, or the north of it here, or the east of it here, and in between, it's dry as a bone. So you can't grow anything by natural rainfall in between. So wheat and barley are first noted here, southern Turkey and Israel, Palestine. But the transformation of a grain culture into a civilization takes place here in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, and separately and in different ways over here in the Valley of the Nile. When we write the history of civilization, that's usually chapter 1. The discovery of farming and the development of the farming civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are 2 reasons why we do it this way. One is that this is where the archaeology was done first, and whoever comes first wins. The second reason is that we're all descended from farmers, and there is a positive bias toward grain farming in underlying histories of Western civilization. Sometimes the bias is subtle, sometimes it is pretty blatant. It has a very strong racist element to it that basically says, well, I could even give you the citation of one article in a scientific publication where the argument is made that people who learned how to grow wheat and barley also learned how to look at the sky and determine the seasons. They learned how to create a calendar. That meant they had to learn mathematics. And they learned how to harness animals to plows. And they learned how to schedule their time, and so blah, blah, blah, blah. And they just became such good little Methodists because they were growing wheat and barley. By contrast, during this article, if you look at your African, You're always in trouble when you're talking about your something. If you look at your African, he sticks a hole in the ground with a stick and he puts in a piece of a yam, comes back sometime, digs it up again, eats it. What has he learned? And the literature is full of this denigration of any form of food production other than the growth of grain. The production of grain is taken as what civilization is all about. Archaeologically, one of the ways you discover whether grain is being produced in a society is you examine the teeth of the human skeletons for tooth decay. Only in grain cultures do you have tooth decay. If you're living in a hunting and foraging community, no tooth decay. You can eat all the horse and amaranthus seed you want, and you will have no cavities. But as soon as you get hooked on bread and wheat and barley, your teeth just go to pot. And there are a lot of other arguments to be made that eating grain is not good for you, but we've become biased in this direction. It's also affected our concept of what an animal herder is like. Animal herders in various constructions of prehistory are visualized as parasites that swoop down upon innocent farmers and steal their wheat and barley, or alternatively that will barter meat and milk for wheat and barley. There is no theoretical niche for people who don't eat wheat and barley. And the idea is that somehow the animal culture is derivative from the grain culture. But in fact, we now know it's not. And if you go back to, let us say, 4000 BC, the largest communities in the world, in terms of numbers of people living together in built communities, were not here in the Fertile Crescent. They're up here in the Balkans. That's where the big cities were. But they weren't cities, because there's no indication in these communities that you have a division of labor or the rise of a class stratified society. It's in the wheat and barley lands that kings and priests arise as the people who exploit the farmers. And in the pastoral lands, much farther to the north, for a long time you have a much stronger tradition of social equality. And when that tradition gives way to one of class stratification, the dominant class is not the priests. In Mesopotamia, you can argue that the priests, or in Egypt, that the priests really developed dominant roles. But up here, it's the warriors. And it's the warrior class that becomes associated with riding in chariots, managing horses, and imposing their will upon neighboring peoples. So out of this we have a theory that the Indo-Iranians, the Indians and the Iranians, swept down from the north in a great invasion fueled by chariot warfare and imposed their will on Iran and other parts. And that no longer really seems to work. It was not a big invasion. It was not a overwhelming pattern of conquest. But you did end up with people coming into Iran for whom a particular type of class structure and warrior emphasis became noted and continues for a very long period of time. The nature of that society is what I'll talk about on Thursday. Until then, I have office hours on Wednesday from 2 to 5.